Our first reading is from John chapter 21, verses 1 to 8. Later, Jesus himself appeared again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. This is how it happened. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 other disciples were together. Simon Peter told them, "I'm going fishing." They said, "We'll go with you." They sat out in a boat, but throughout the night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't recognize it was Jesus. Jesus called to them, "Children, have you caught anything to eat?" They answered him, "No." He said, "Cast your net on the right of the boat, and you will find some." So they did, and there were so many fish that they couldn't haul in the net. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard this, it was the Lord, he wrapped his coat around himself, for he was naked, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they weren't far from the shore, only about 100 yards. Here ends the first reading.
So John's gospel concludes in the last 2 chapters with 4 appearances of the resurrected Jesus to 4 different groups of disciples. There are 4 scenes then where Christ is revealed as being alive, assurances that death could not contain the life that Jesus lived and continues to live. 2 weeks ago on Easter Sunday morning, we heard the story of how Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, expecting to find Jesus and his body. But Jesus appeared, you may recall, first misidentified by Mary as the gardener. And then as God's light flooded upon her, she recognized the rabbi, her teacher. Later that same day, last Sunday, we heard the story about Jesus appearing in the room where the disciples had gathered together that day. But you may recall that one of the disciples, Thomas, was missing, and he did not see Jesus appear on that afternoon. And so the following week, Jesus returned yet again, and this time Thomas was there. Thomas sees with his own eyes, reaches out with his own hands, and touches the wounds of Jesus. And then he confesses his belief. And in response, Jesus said this. He says, "Have you believed, Thomas, because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now, all 3 of these appearances take place in Jerusalem, where Jesus had been, where the crucifixion and his death and resurrection occurred. They all happened within a week of Jesus' death. Jesus' disciples, we may recall, are still filled with fear, though. It's not quite sure what they are supposed to do or what is going to happen next. But as they say, life carries on. And so the days continue. And this 4th and final appearance, which we're hearing this morning, here in chapter 21, actually happens not in Jerusalem, but in Galilee. As you heard Steve reading, he said the Sea of Tiberias, that is simply another name for the Sea of Galilee, where the beginning of the story happened, where Jesus first calls his disciples. And so the disciples have returned back home. They are away from Jerusalem, where all the troubles had happened, and they're back in their familiar territory. And you get a sense that they still don't quite know what to do. As we heard, Peter said, "Well, let's just go fishing." And they make their way out to the sea, but are unsuccessful. And so we're going to continue on in this same story, John 21, verses 9 through 19. If you'd like to read along, you can find it on your goldenrod sheet in the bulletin. Those of you at home should see it up on your screen. So I'm going to pick up where Steve left off. So when the disciples landed, they saw a fire there on the beach with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've caught." Simon Peter got up and pulled the net to shore. It was full of large fish, 153 of them. Yet the net hadn't torn. even with so many fish. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples could bring themselves to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus had appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they finished eating, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Jesus asked a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Take care of my sheep." He asked a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was sad that Jesus asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" He replied, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. I assure you that when you were younger, you tied your own belt and walked around wherever you wanted. When you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will tie your belt and lead you where you don't want to go." He said this to show the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And after saying this, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Some of you may know Wendell Berry, who is a well-known poet and novelist and essayist, who is also a farmer in rural Kentucky. Berry makes an interesting observation about reading the Bible. He claims that it is, quote, an outdoor activity. More specifically, he writes this. He said, "I don't think it's appreciated how much of an outdoor book the Bible is. It is best read and understood outdoors, and the further outdoors, the better. Or that has been my experience of it. Passages that within the walls seem improbable or incredible, outdoors seem merely natural." Now that claim came to mind this week as we read from John chapter 21, which is certainly an outdoors story. As the disciples are out on the lake of Tiberias fishing, and then as they return to the beach and there outdoors, they have Jesus in front of a fire cooking breakfast for them. In one of his poems, Wendell Berry writes this: "So, friends, every day do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing. Take all you have and be poor. Let someone love someone who does not deserve it. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Ask questions that have no answers, and practice resurrection." Now, that simple but profound statement to practice resurrection, I think, is at the heart of our gospel lesson this morning. As it in some ways, I think, at the heart of all of John's gospel. So I want to explore this morning how we might go about practicing resurrection, how we might be called to practice resurrection in our own time and our own setting today. But let's start with the beginning, with the basics, and that is the word practice. Now, if you look in the English dictionary, you find that it has two primary meanings. The first meaning is the repeated exercise in or performance of an activity or a skill. So perhaps think of a musician, someone who sings or plays the piano, someone who paints. Think of someone who is an athlete. Anything that requires skill requires practice over and over again. There's a story about the famous cellist Pablo Casals. He, at the age of 93, was asked why he continued to practice from 4 to 6 hours a day. He replied this, "I'm beginning to notice some improvement." Practice, practice, practice. But practice has another meaning as well. It is the actual application of an idea, a belief, or a method, as opposed to theories about such an application or a use. So an example of this is you think of lawyers and doctors have a practice, right? Now we hope they're not just learning as they practice, right? But it's the repeated application of those skills and experiences that they have gained over the years. And I mentioned both of these meanings because I think both of them are at work here in John, as John explores what it means to practice resurrection, what it means to have faith or belief in Jesus Christ. Because we need actual application of faith. It needs to be acted out in some real concrete way, John tells us. But faith and belief are also a repeated exercise of skill. It's not something we do one time and are completed. We do it over and over and over again. So how is Jesus calling us to practice resurrection in our story today? Let's take a closer look. Now, one of the things I notice in this story from John 21 is that in many ways it is both a gentle and an ordinary story. It is in Galilee, back where the story first began in John chapter 1. And so it's not there in Jerusalem in the center of power and influence and wealth, but rather it is in the ethnically and diversified area of Galilee, where there are many working poor, where there are many peasants. Not a glamorous place to be. And certainly it is not a place where we would expect the drama of salvation to unfold. And in fact, in the story, there's very little drama, right? There's no locked doors where Jesus suddenly appears. Instead, we find just this core group of disciples out fishing, which means they're going back to what they know, what they were doing before Jesus first called them. They're going back to what is familiar and comfortable, to the rhythms of everyday life that they knew before Jesus. And we're told that as dawn approaches, as they go out fishing throughout the night, that they haven't caught anything, which I think clearly is a sign, right? There's something going on here, that they have caught no fish at all. And as they notice a man there on the beach, they don't recognize him, or they're not quite sure who this is. And he tells them to let their nets down on the other side of the boat, as if these experienced fishermen don't know what they're doing. And yet, miraculously, when they do this, they catch a huge overabundance of fish that is straining their nets. And then Peter, who is always the impetuous one, we're told, puts on a robe, jumps in the water, and swims to shore ahead of everyone else. And we note that he finds Jesus there cooking over a charcoal fire some bread and some fish. Now, you recall that earlier story about the multiplication, right, of the bread and the fish? And certainly there's some reference to that. There's something going on here, more than meets the eye, as so often is the case in John's Gospel. The author Nora Gallagher uses Wendell Berry's poem as an inspiration for the title to a book that she wrote a few years ago. It is titled Practicing Resurrection, with a subtitle, A Memoir of Work, Doubt, Discernment, and Moments of Grace. And in the book she writes this. She says, "We seem to spend so much time in the church either believing in the resurrection or not believing in the resurrection, that somehow we may be losing the point." She says, what if the resurrection is not about the appearances of Jesus alone? It's not either whether we turn them into some kind of superstition or whether we use them as a stepping stone for a new life. We have to practice resurrection. And that's what the appearances of Jesus are inviting us to do. So we recognize in the story this morning that practicing resurrection does not need any kind of special setting. It doesn't need a spectacular act by Jesus, but rather it happens back at home for the disciples in the familiar rhythms of their life as they sit down for breakfast with some friends. The author E.B. White, who famously wrote both the story Charlotte's Web and the wonderful book Stuart Little, once wrote an essay about his wife, Catherine, as she was nearing the end of her life. He notes that Catherine loved to spend time in their garden, and that each year she carefully planned a new diagram and design for the year's garden planting. After she became ill and was almost incapacitated, she somehow managed, he said, to drag herself outside when it was time to plant. And here's what he writes. He says, armed with a diagram and a clipboard, Catherine would get into a shabby old raincoat, put on a little round wool hat, and proceed to the director's chair placed at the edge of her garden plot. There she would sit hour after hour in any kind of wind and weather, surrounded by dozens of packages of new bulbs and a basket of old ones, ready for an intricate interment. There was something touching about her bedraggled appearance on that awesome occasion. The small, hunched-over figure, her studied absorption in the implausible notion that there would be another spring. Oblivious to the ending of her own days, she knew perfectly well that the end was near at hand. Sitting there with her chart under those dark skies in the dying October light, calmly plotting the resurrection. And I think that's what our story is inviting us to as well today. But we know too that there's two parts to our story. It doesn't end with the breakfast there, but instead we have a threefold question and answer between Jesus and Simon Peter. The scene clearly points to a profound moment of failure and shame for Peter. You remember after Jesus' arrest, Peter was around another charcoal fire outside of Pilate's palace, and on 3 different occasions he is asked, "Do you know this man Jesus? Are you his follower?" And 3 times he denied being Jesus' disciple. And we can see here, I think, reflecting on that Jesus is giving a lesson of practicing resurrection. He's not there to shame Peter for his previous actions. He's not totally forgetting it or pretending it didn't happen either. But rather, in a profound act of love, Jesus brings about healing and wholeness to this relationship with his most profound disciple. And in doing so, we note that Peter receives a new mission and a new purpose. "Feed my lambs," Jesus said. "Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep." And so in the story, Peter is not just forgiven and restored, but he's also given a new and fresh challenge, a new task, and new work to do. He is to share in Jesus' own work of being a shepherd to the people and take that into the future as his vocation. One author calls this a blueprint for ministry for the church. Because we note that there is a shift here, that it begins with the fishing, with the gathering and the catching and the bringing in, but that is not the final end. Because also there is shepherding, there is the caring for, the tending and the feeding, the compassionate work of those who have been gathered, and finally there is the sending them back out to do the purpose and the work of God's kingdom in the world. And so to practice resurrection, I think John is telling us here, is to put the power of the resurrection in our own lives and into our own setting. It is to live the way that Jesus called us to live. To practice resurrection is to see the power of Easter still alive in our world today. It is to be conduits of that love and that energy and that compassion that God has revealed to us. It is to remind the world that death in all of its forms is not the final word, but rather death that could not hold Jesus in the tomb is not able to hold us by the power and grace of God. Now, our scripture readings for this morning bring us to the end of John's Gospel. We've been in it since way back at Christmas time, but as we come to the end, I want to share a commentary by Debbie Thomas. And I think it speaks to both how we practice resurrection, but also the difference it makes to being a disciple in the world for us today. She writes this, she says, all of these post-resurrection appearances speak to God's priorities in our world. Because in the days following the resurrection, Jesus, we notice, doesn't waste a moment on revenge or retribution. He doesn't storm Pilate's house. He doesn't avenge himself on the Roman Empire. He doesn't punish the soldiers who drove the nails into his hands. He doesn't refute the chief priests and those who accused him. Instead, Jesus spends his remaining days on earth feeding, restoring, and strengthening his friends. He calls Mary Magdalene by name. He offers his wounds to the skeptical Thomas. He grills bread and fish for his hungry disciples. He heals what is wounded and festering in his heart and in Peter's. In other words, Jesus focuses on relationships and on reconciliation and on love. He spends his last days delivering his children from fear, despair, self-hatred, and paralysis. He wastes no time on triumphalism or on smugness or on arrogance. And at the height of his power and glory, he chooses humility and love. And so Jesus today chooses to linger on a lonely beach until dawn, waiting for his hungry children to realize how much they need him. He chooses to ask Peter honest and vulnerable-making questions about denial, even though the answer might hurt. He chooses to feed and to tend his sheep. And that, friends, is how you practice resurrection. And so as we come to the end of John's Gospel, of this long journey following Jesus before his ascension, I think we're left here not with some grand theological dissertation or treatise, but rather with a quiet and persistent invitation that comes again and again. Jesus meets these weary fishermen out there at dawn. He feeds them, heals them. He takes the shame that has broken them and turned it into trust and love and newness. Feed my lambs, he says, tend my sheep. And so too we go from this place into our week ahead, into our lives and everyday lives, and we are called by that same invitation to practice resurrection. We too are called, as the poet reminds us, to do something that doesn't compute. Love someone who doesn't deserve it. Tend a garden of hope. Forgive an old wound. Share a simple meal. Because in these very acts, we are learning about resurrection, but we are also living it in our day-to-day lives. We are putting Easter into practice. And so remember, friends, we do not practice alone, that the risen Christ who is present with his friends is also present with us as we go forth to practice resurrection. To God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.